The memorial stones were already carved. 16 names. 16 Navy SEALs who had walked into the Kunar Valley knowing the odds were mathematical suicide. The chaplain had written the service. The families had been notified using the past tense. At Bagram Airfield, someone had already started clearing out lockers. But Lieutenant Commander Marcus Voss, watching through thermal optics from a cave entrance 17 clicks inside enemy territory, wasn't dead yet. He was just extremely good at math, and the math said he had about 90 minutes before the math stopped mattering. His radio had taken shrapnel 4 hours ago. His medic had stopped breathing 2 hours ago. And the Taliban fighters moving up the valley were using a tactical pattern that suggested someone with actual military training was coordinating them. Voss counted shadows against snowpack. 43 visible, maybe twice that in the tree line. His remaining 14 men had enough ammunition for one more meaningful engagement. Then it would be rocks and knives and the kind of last stand that made for good eulogies. He thought about his daughter's last voicemail, something about a school play. He hadn't listened to all of it. The command structure had written them off 6 hours ago. Too deep, too many hostiles, too much political cost for a rescue operation that had maybe 12% chance of success. Voss understood. He'd have made the same call. Above the valley, at 22,000 feet, Captain Iris Thorne was flying her 7th hour in an A-10C Thunderbolt II that the maintenance chief had personally advised her not to take up. The Warthog had hydraulic issues, avionics glitches. The right engine ran hot, but Thorne had looked at the mission board, seen the SEAL team's last known position, done her own math, and signed for the aircraft anyway. Her call sign was Widow, not because of any husband. Because of what happened to enemy positions after she left them. The ops officer had tried to stop her at the flight line. "Captain, that valley is denied airspace. We have no comm with the team. Command has assessed the situation as non-viable." Thorne had kept walking. "Then nobody will mind if I waste some fuel looking at mountains." She'd launched without clearance, headed east into weather that was turning the Hindu Kush into a wall of gray static. And now, 17 minutes from the SEAL team's last known coordinates, her radar warning receiver was lighting up like a Christmas tree. Someone down there had SA-24 Igla missiles. Someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of heroic stupidity. The SA-24 launches came from 3 positions simultaneously, contrails drawing white lines through the clouds like accusatory fingers. Thorne saw them at 8 miles. The A-10's countermeasure system was designed in 1972 and worked about as reliably as a coin flip. She dumped flares, banked hard left into a valley channel that was barely wider than her wingspan, and listened to her aircraft scream warnings in 3 different mechanical voices. The first missile lost lock on the flares. The second missile did not care about flares. It was tracking her engine heat signature with the single-minded devotion of a bill collector. Thorne did something the flight manual listed under emergency procedures likely to cause structural failure. She chopped both throttles to idle, deployed full air brakes, and dropped her Warthog toward the valley floor like a 30,000-pound anvil. The missile, expecting evasion to mean speed and altitude, overshot by 600 meters and detonated against a cliff face. Thorne relit her engines at 4,200 feet, pulled out of the dive at an angle that made her vision gray at the edges, and keyed her radio. "Any coalition ground call sign, this is Widow. I'm Winchester on Patience. If you need killing done, speak now." Static. Then a voice that sounded like it was being transmitted through gravel and broken glass. "Widow, Reaper 6. We're 17 clicks east of Checkpoint Viper, approximately 200 hostiles. We have 14 effectives and maybe 1 magazine per man. If you're real now would be outstanding." Thorne checked her coordinates. The SEAL team was in a valley the terrain maps listed as inadvisable for rotary operations and unsuitable for fixed-wing support. The walls were too steep, the ceiling too low, the political considerations too complicated. She nosed her A-10 toward the coordinates anyway. "Reaper 6, Widow. I'm 2 minutes out. Paint me something ugly." Voss, crouched behind a boulder that had probably been there since the Pleistocene era, couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Widow, be advised, valley walls are extremely close. Minimum ceiling may be 5,000 feet, Multiple MANPADS confirmed. The voice that came back was calm the way a lake is calm right before it freezes solid. Reaper 6, that's adorable. Now paint the target. Voss aimed his laser designator at the largest concentration of muzzle flashes and held it steady despite the tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with blood loss. When the A-10 came over the ridgeline, it came low enough that Voss could see the nose art, a black widow spider smoking a cigarette. The A-10 Thunderbolt II is not beautiful. It looks like something designed by a committee whose only instruction was make it ugly enough to intimidate buildings. The engines sit high on the fuselage like afterthoughts. The cockpit is a titanium bathtub wrapped in metal. The whole aircraft is essentially a 30-foot cannon with wings bolted on as a grudging concession to aerodynamics. When Thorne brought hers into the valley, flying barely 300 feet above the deck, it sounded like God clearing his throat. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon is the A-10's reason for existence. 7 barrels, 65 rounds per second, depleted uranium penetrators moving at 3,400 feet per second. When Thorne squeezed the trigger, the sound was less like gunfire and more like the universe tearing along a perforated line. The first burst walked across the tree line where Voss's laser designator was painting. 20 Taliban fighters simply ceased to exist in the meaningful sense. The survivors scattered, which was tactically sound but strategically pointless because Thorne was already rolling inverted, pulling through a canyon turn that put her nose back on target, firing again. The second burst caught a mortar position. The third found a technical truck with a mounted machine gun. By the fourth burst, the Taliban fighters were doing what any rational person would do when being engaged by an A-10, running and praying their God was more attentive than hers. Voss watched through his optics, momentarily forgetting about his own mortality. "Jesus Christ," someone said over the Team Freak. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Thorne wasn't done. She'd spotted the SA-24 teams repositioning on the northern ridge. They were trying to get an angle while she was low and slow in the valley, professional, disciplined, exactly the kind of target she'd been hunting her entire career. She pulled her A-10 into a climbing turn that exposed her belly to every small arm in the valley, released 2 Maverick missiles at the MANPADS positions, and rolled back toward the deck as the missiles did their angry work. The northern ridge became a brief sunrise. Reaper 6, Widow. "You're going to have company coming up the valley from the west. I count 30+ dismounts, 2 vehicles. I can discourage them or I can remove them. Your call." Voss looked at his remaining ammunition, looked at his men, looked at the dust cloud approaching from the west. "Remove them, Widow," with prejudice. Thorne's response was 2 words: "Guns, guns." The next 90 seconds were educational for everyone involved. What separates adequate close air support from the kind that gets written into tactical doctrine is patience. Thorne had patience the way glaciers have patience. She made 5 separate gun runs on the western approach, each one precisely calculated to push the enemy formation into a narrower and narrower killing box. She didn't waste ammunition on warning shots or suppressive fire. Every burst was anatomical. When a technical truck tried to reverse out of the valley, she put a 2-second burst through its engine block. When fighters tried to use a rock formation for cover, she came from a different angle where the rocks became a liability. By the 6th pass, the survivors were surrendering to the mountain itself. Voss watched the tactical situation transform from writing last letters to maybe we see next Tuesday in under 10 minutes. His XO, a chief petty officer named Rains who had opinions about everything, was watching Thorne's A-10 with the expression usually reserved for religious experiences. "Sir, who the hell is that?" Voss keyed his radio. "Widow Reaper 6, you just saved 16 lives. We're combat ineffective for movement. Can you stay on station?" There was a pause. When Thorne responded, her voice carried a weight that Voss recognized instantly. Combat calculus. The math that measured fuel against time against likelihood of additional threats. "Reaper 6, I'm at bingo fuel in 12 minutes. I can give you 8. Extraction package is being scrambled out of Bagram. ETA 42 minutes. You're going to have to be alive and interesting for another half hour after I leave. Voss looked at his team, looked at the valley approaches, did his own math. We can make that work if you've killed everything with opinions. Thorn banked her A-10 into a wide orbit over the valley. Below her, the terrain was painted in the specific palette of recent violence, smoke, debris, the kind of silence that follows industrial-scale gunfire. She checked her fuel state, checked her ammunition, checked the sky, which was starting to clear in a way that meant either hope or irony, depending on your philosophical orientation. Reaper 6, I've got 7 minutes of playtime and 200 rounds. If anything moves with hostile intent, I'll introduce them to physics. Voss allowed himself something almost like optimism. Widow, when we get home, first beer is on me. The response was so dry it could start fires. Reaper, I don't drink with people who can't maintain radio discipline in hot zones. Rains, listening on the Team Freak, actually laughed. It was the first laugh the valley had heard in 6 hours. The extraction helicopters came in low and angry, 2 MH-60s with door gunners who looked disappointed they wouldn't get to contribute to the violence. Thorn stayed high overhead, orbiting at the edge of her fuel reserves, watching her fuel gauge decline with the steady inevitability of bad news. The SEALs loaded in under 3 minutes. Professional. Efficient. Already thinking about the hot showers and cold depression that followed missions where you watched friends bleed. As the helicopters lifted, Voss keyed his radio one last time. Widow, Reaper 6, we're clear and climbing. You've got our eternal gratitude and a serious bar tab when we land. Thorn watched the helicopters disappear into the safe distance, then turned her Warthog west toward Bagram. Her fuel light was on. Both engines were running hot. The hydraulic system was making sounds that maintenance chiefs have nightmares about. Reaper 6, Widow, get home safe. Try not to die of anything boring. She shut down the tactical frequency, climbed to altitude, and focused on the very real possibility that her aircraft might decide to stop being an aircraft somewhere over extremely hostile terrain. The A-10 rattled and shook and made concerning grinding noises. Thorn patted the instrument panel with something approaching affection. Come on, ugly. Get me home and I'll let them fix everything I broke today. The Warthog, powered by spite and obsolete engineering, kept flying. 27 minutes later, Thorn landed at Bagram on fumes and prayers. The fire crews were waiting. The maintenance chief took one look at her aircraft and started cursing in 3 languages. The ops officer was waiting at debriefing with an expression that combined relief, fury, and administrative exhaustion. Captain Thorn, you launched without clearance, flew into denied airspace, engaged targets without proper authorization, and violated about 15 regulations I can name off the top of my head. Thorn handed over her helmet. Yes, sir. 16 SEALs are alive. I'll accept whatever paperwork makes that acceptable. The ops officer stared at her, stared at the maintenance chief who was cataloging damage on her A-10, stared at the message coming through on his radio about a SEAL team extracted successfully from what command had classified as a non-survivable situation. Get some food, Captain. We'll discuss your future later. Thorn walked toward the chow hall, still wearing her flight suit that smelled like jet fuel and cordite. Behind her, someone started the process of turning a clear violation of orders into something that might eventually resemble a commendation. The bar at Bagram was technically against regulations, existed anyway, and served alcohol that tasted like what you'd imagine. 3 days after the extraction, Voss found Thorn there, sitting alone at a corner table, working through what looked like her 3rd beer. He approached carefully, the way you approach someone who's clearly negotiating with private demons. Captain Thorn, she looked up. Her eyes were the particular shade of gray that weather systems aspire to. Lieutenant Commander. I heard the memorial service got canceled. Voss sat without asking. Postponed indefinitely. Apparently we're all harder to kill than expected. I wanted to say thank you properly, without radio static. Thorn shrugged. You would have done the same. No, Voss said quietly. I wouldn't have. I'd have followed orders, gone home, filed the appropriate reports. You launched into denied airspace in a broken aircraft to save people command had already written off. That's not protocol, that's something else. Thorne studied her beer like it might contain answers. I don't leave people behind, it's not complicated. But it was complicated, and Voss knew enough about human behavior to recognize the weight behind those words. Your call sign, widow, there's a story there. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. There's always a story, doesn't mean it needs telling. Voss nodded slowly. Fair enough. But if you ever want to tell it, 16 SEALs will listen. He stood, placed a card on the table with his contact information, and walked away before she could deflect further. Thorne looked at the card, looked at her beer, looked at nothing in particular. The thing about being called widow was that everyone assumed it meant she killed enemy forces efficiently. They assumed it was about lethality, tactical competence, the kind of call sign you earned through successful missions. They were wrong. 5 years ago, she'd been Captain Iris Thorne, instructor pilot, stationed at Davis-Monthan. She'd been married to Major David Chen, F-16 pilot who flew with the kind of aggressive precision that made him valuable and worried her constantly. She'd asked him once to be more careful. He'd laughed, kissed her forehead, said being careful wasn't how you stayed sharp. Then he'd taken an F-16 into contested airspace over Syria, made all the right decisions, followed all the correct procedures, and run into a S-400 missile that didn't care about his tactics. The funeral had full honors, 21-gun salute, folded flag, condolences from officers who meant well and understood nothing. Thorne had stood there in dress blues, listening to speeches about sacrifice and service, feeling absolutely hollow. She'd returned to flight status after 30 days. Command had suggested grief counseling. She'd suggested they clear her for combat deployment instead. They'd compromised by keeping her stateside as an instructor. For 3 years. 3 years of teaching young pilots how to not die while watching the operational tempo overseas increase. 3 years of being safe and useful and slowly calcifying into anger. The call sign widow had started as mess hall dark humor, someone's tasteless joke about her always flying solo. It had stuck because she'd refused to acknowledge it, and what you refuse to acknowledge in military culture becomes permanent. She'd stopped correcting people, stopped explaining. Let them think it meant whatever they wanted it to mean. When she'd finally gotten orders for Afghanistan, the squadron commander had pulled her aside. Captain, you've got nothing to prove. You're one of our best instructors. You can do more good here. She'd looked at him with eyes that had stopped pretending months ago. Sir, with respect, I've done enough good here. I need to do some bad over there. He'd approved her transfer. Now, sitting in a technically illegal bar at Bagram, drinking beer that tasted like regret, Thorne wondered if David would recognize her anymore. She'd become efficient at violence, professional at killing. The kind of pilot who launched into denied airspace because leaving people to die felt worse than violating orders. She wasn't sure if that meant she'd honored his memory or betrayed everything he'd valued about caution and tactical patience. Her phone buzzed. A text from her squadron commander. Debrief 800 tomorrow. Bring coffee, you're going to need it. Thorne finished her beer, stood, and walked out into the Afghan night. Above her, the stars were bright enough to navigate by. She thought about Voss and his team, alive because she'd ignored the math that said they were already dead. Thought about David, dead because sometimes the math doesn't care about your skill. Thought about the distance between those two facts and whether it meant anything. She didn't have answers. She just had flight status and an A-10 that maintenance had somehow coaxed back to operational readiness. Tomorrow there would be more missions, more valleys, more math. Tonight she let herself be grateful that 16 people would see their families because she'd been too stubborn to accept reasonable orders. The debrief started at 8:02 because Thorne had stopped for coffee twice. The squadron commander, Colonel Sarah Hendricks, sat behind a desk covered in incident reports and looked like someone managing a migraine through pure willpower. Captain Thorne, sit. Thorne sat. Hendricks slid a folder across the desk. That's the preliminary after-action report from Reaper 6. He's recommended you for a Distinguished Flying Cross. The SEALs have started a petition. 3 separate generals want to either commend you or court-martial you, and they're still arguing about which. Thorne opened the folder. Read Voss's account of the engagement. His description of her gun runs used words like surgical and devastating, and only reason we're not in body bags. Ma'am, I violated standing orders. Launched without clearance. Entered denied airspace. Hendricks held up a hand. Captain, I'm aware. I'm also aware that 16 Navy SEALs are currently alive, eating breakfast and annoying people specifically because you decided regulations were more like suggestions. Command is trying to figure out if you're a hero or a problem. Thorne met her eyes. Can't I be both? Hendricks almost smiled. Probably. Here's the situation. You're getting a medal. You're also getting a formal reprimand in your jacket. Command wants to make it clear that what you did was necessary, commendable, and not to be repeated by anyone with worse judgment or less skill. She closed the folder. Thorne, you're one of the best combat pilots I've seen. You're also carrying something that makes you dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with enemy forces. I need to know you're flying for the right reasons. Thorne considered lying, considered deflecting, decided Hendricks had earned honesty. Ma'am, I'm flying because 16 people went home, because David didn't, because the math doesn't balance, but maybe I can weight the scales slightly less wrong. That good enough? Hendricks studied her for a long moment. No, but it's honest and I can work with honest. You're cleared for flight status. Try to follow orders at least 50% of the time. Dismissed. Thorne stood, saluted, got halfway to the door before Hendricks spoke again. Captain, your husband would be proud, not of the violations, of the saves. Thorne didn't trust herself to respond. She just nodded and left. Outside, the Afghan sun was turning Bagram into an oven. She walked toward the flight line where her A-10 sat, looking slightly less damaged than yesterday. The crew chief, a technical sergeant named Ramirez who treated his aircraft like troubled children, was doing a post-maintenance inspection. Captain, your Warthog is flight-ready, which is either a miracle or a crime against physics. I've signed off on the repairs, but I'm entering a formal complaint about your treatment of hydraulic systems. Thorne ran her hand along the fuselage. The metal was warm from the sun. Ramirez, you're a genius. I promise to abuse her more gently next time. Ramirez snorted. Captain, you fly this aircraft like you're testing whether it can survive spite. But she got you home, so maybe spite works. He handed over the maintenance log. You've got a mission brief at 1400. Routine patrol, which knowing you means someone's getting a very bad afternoon. Thorne signed the log. Read the mission brief. Routine patrol along the Pakistan border. No active targets. No urgent taskings. The kind of mission designed to make pilots feel useful while keeping them away from complicated political situations, which meant it was exactly the kind of mission that would turn interesting. She spent the next 3 hours in the Tactical Operations Center, studying terrain maps, weather patterns, radio frequencies. Other pilots came and went, most of them younger, some of them curious about the captain who'd apparently decided regulations were decorative. A young lieutenant, fresh from flight school and eager in the way that suggested he hadn't watched anyone die yet, approached carefully. Captain Thorne, I'm Lieutenant Davies. I just wanted to say, what you did for those SEALs was amazing. Like textbook close air support. Thorne looked at him, saw David in his enthusiasm, saw herself before she'd learned that textbooks don't account for missiles. Lieutenant, it wasn't textbook. Textbook would have been following orders and letting someone else make the call. What I did was gambling with an expensive aircraft because the alternative seemed worse. Davies blinked. But it worked. This time, Thorne said quietly. Ask me about the times it didn't work. I'll tell you about pilots who made the same gamble and didn't land. She softened her tone because crushing enthusiasm wasn't productive. Davies, be aggressive when it matters. Be cautious when it counts. Learn the difference before the difference learns you. She left him thinking about that and headed to the flight line. Her A-10 sat waiting, ugly and functional, loaded with enough ordnance to ruin someone's entire day. Thorne did her pre-flight check with the methodical attention she'd learned from David. Check the control surfaces. Check the weapons load. Check the engines. Trust but verify. Always verify. She climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and began her startup sequence. The afternoon patrol was supposed to be boring. Thorne flew her assigned route along the border, maintaining altitude, checking in with AWACS every 20 minutes, watching the mountains scroll past below. The Hindu Kush looked peaceful from 20,000 feet, almost beautiful, like a postcard from a place that wanted to kill you. She was 90 minutes into the patrol when the radio crackled. Widow, Sentry, we're showing increased activity near Checkpoint Delta. Multiple vehicles, possible hostile intent. Recommend you investigate. Thorne checked her fuel state, her weapons load, her position relative to Checkpoint Delta. 3 minutes flying time. Sentry, Widow, moving to investigate. She nosed her A-10 toward Delta, descended to 12,000 feet, switched her targeting pod to active. The checkpoint was a small combat outpost, 30 soldiers, designed to monitor traffic on a mountain pass. Through her pod, Thorne counted 6 trucks approaching from the north, moving fast. No identification markings. The kind of tactical approach that suggested they weren't delivering humanitarian supplies. She keyed the checkpoint frequency. Delta, Widow, I'm overhead. You've got 6 vehicles inbound from your north. Can you identify? The voice that responded sounded young and stressed. Widow, Delta, negative on identification. They're not responding to warnings. We're a platoon strength position. If those trucks are hostile, we're about to have a really bad day. Thorne watched the trucks close the distance. 2 minutes from the checkpoint. She could see fighters in the truck beds, could see weapons, could see the specific body language of people preparing for violence. Delta, Widow, vehicles are hostile. I'm engaging. She didn't wait for confirmation. Didn't wait for clearance from command. Because command was comfortable at Bagram and Delta was about to get overrun by superior numbers. Thorne rolled her A-10 into a dive, selected the lead truck, and fired a single Maverick missile. The truck ceased to exist in a fireball that turned the mountain pass into temporary daylight. The other trucks scattered, which was tactically sound but operationally pointless because Thorne was already lining up her gun run. The GAU-8 spoke its single-syllable opinion. The second truck disintegrated. The third truck tried to reverse. Thorne put a 2-second burst through its engine. The remaining trucks deployed fighters who scattered into the rocks, trying to use terrain for cover. Professional. Disciplined. Exactly the kind of enemy Thorne had been training to fight for 5 years. She came around for another pass, flying low enough to see individual fighters, high enough to stay outside effective small arms range. The fight lasted 11 minutes. Thorne made 6 gun runs, used 3 Mavericks, and taught the surviving Taliban fighters an important lesson about attacking American positions when an A-10 was overhead. By the time she pulled off target, the mountain pass looked like a salvage yard designed by someone with anger issues. She keyed the checkpoint frequency. Delta, Widow, hostiles are neutralized. You're clear. The response came back shaky but grateful. Widow, Delta, you just saved our lives. We were about to be seriously overrun. Thorne checked her fuel state, enough to get home with a reasonable margin. Delta, next time maybe shoot back before they get close enough to shake hands. Widow is RTB. She turned west toward Bagram, climbed back to altitude, and listened to the AWACS controller update the tactical picture. The checkpoint at Delta was secure. The hostile vehicles were destroyed. Everything was routine except for the part where 30 American soldiers almost got overrun. When she landed, the debrief was waiting. So was Colonel Hendricks, looking less migraine-managed than this morning. Captain Thorne, that's twice this week you've decided to engage targets without waiting for clearance. Thorne shut down her engines, climbed out of her cockpit. Ma'am, with respect, if I'd waited for clearance, Delta would be overrun. Sometimes the decision point is faster than the approval process. Hendricks pinched the bridge of her nose. Captain, you're making it very difficult for me to argue you're not a loose cannon. Ma'am, I prefer tactical initiative. I prefer following orders, but apparently that's negotiable in your world. Hendricks sighed. The Delta commander is writing you a commendation. You're also getting a second formal counseling about engagement protocols. At this rate, you're going to have a jacket that reads like a split personality disorder. Thorne said nothing. Hendricks studied her. Thorne, I get it. I do. You're good at this, probably too good. But you're also flying like someone who thinks they're invincible, and invincible is how pilots end up in memorial services. Thorne met her eyes. I'm flying like someone who knows they're not invincible but goes anyway. There's a difference." Hendricks held her gaze, then nodded slowly. "Get some rest, Captain. You're flying again tomorrow, and I'd prefer you be slightly less interested in violating protocols." Thorne saluted, walked away, and didn't mention that rest wasn't something she was particularly good at anymore. That night Thorne couldn't sleep. She lay in her rack at the transient quarters, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of generators and helicopters, and the ambient noise of a military base that never quite turned off. She thought about Delta, about the young voice on the radio, stressed but holding together, about the trucks that would have reached the checkpoint if she'd waited for clearance, about David, who'd always followed protocols, always requested permission, always done everything by the book. The book had gotten him killed anyway. She got up, walked to the rec room, found coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through anger, sat alone at a table and pulled out her phone, scrolled through old photos. David in his flight suit, grinning at the camera. David at their wedding, looking impossibly young. David holding a model F-16, explaining thrust-to-weight ratios with the enthusiasm of someone who loved his job. She hadn't looked at these photos in months, had actively avoided them because looking meant feeling and feeling meant bleeding. But tonight, after saving Delta, after the debrief, after another day of being simultaneously commended and counseled, she let herself look, let herself remember, let herself acknowledge that the person she'd been before David died wouldn't recognize the person she'd become after. She wasn't sure if that was growth or damage, wasn't sure if there was a difference. Her phone buzzed. A text from Voss. "Heard you saved another group of grateful Americans. You're making a habit of this. Reaper Team sends regards." Thorne smiled despite herself. Typed back, "Tell Reaper Team to stop requiring rescue. It's bad for my paperwork." The response came quickly. "We'll try, no promises. First beer still on me when you're stateside." She put the phone away, finished her coffee, walked back to her quarters and lay down again. This time sleep came easier. Not because the demons were gone, but because she'd learned to negotiate with them, learned to channel the anger into something that kept people alive. David would have understood that, probably would have worried about it, definitely would have told her to be careful. She whispered to the dark ceiling, to the ghost of someone who couldn't hear but maybe understood anyway. "I'm being as careful as I can while still being useful. That's the best I've got." Outside, Bagram continued its endless operational cycle. Helicopters landed and launched. Generators hummed. Somewhere someone was planning tomorrow's missions. And Thorne's A-10 sat on the flight line, ugly and functional, waiting for the next time someone needed killing done. The weeks accumulated. Thorne flew missions, saved positions, violated protocols with enough success that command stopped counseling and started just documenting. She became the pilot that ground commanders requested by name, the one JTAC controllers wanted on station when situations turned complicated. Her call sign, Widow, stopped being dark humor and started being reputation. Lieutenant Davies, the young pilot she'd spoken to after the SEAL rescue, started flying with a measured aggression that suggested he'd learned the lesson about when to gamble. Other pilots watched her tactics, studied her gun runs, tried to understand how she made decisions that worked but shouldn't. Colonel Hendricks stopped fighting the inevitable and started just ensuring Thorne's paperwork was technically defensible. The bar at Bagram added an unofficial plaque behind the counter, "Widow because someone has to." Thorne pretended not to notice. She flew, she saved, she violated, she documented. She was becoming exactly what she'd needed to become, effective at keeping people alive in a place designed to kill them. But effectiveness came with a cost that didn't show up in after-action reports. She stopped sleeping well, started drinking coffee like it was a tactical requirement, found herself calculating engagement angles during downtime, running scenarios in her head, preparing for emergencies that hadn't happened yet. Other pilots talked about home, about what they'd do when they rotated back stateside. Thorne talked about munitions loadouts and hydraulic systems. The distance between who she'd been and who she was becoming stretched until she couldn't see across it anymore. 4 months into her deployment, She received orders for a mission that made all the previous violations look like minor infractions. A special forces team was pinned down in the Korangal Valley, surrounded